300 ducks crossed a drowned field at dawn. The man who bought them stood waist-deep in mud, laughing for the first time in a year. Behind him, half the county leaned on a fence, certain they were watching a man lose his mind. Certain they were watching the last of his money disappear into 20 acres of standing water. Only one man wasn't laughing. Ronald Stitt stood at the far end of the road, with his arms crossed, and smiled, because he'd already made his calculations. Already knew how this ended. Already had the papers ready for when Kenneth Moore finally broke. What Stitt didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Kenneth had seen something once, 35 years ago, in a flooded field in Louisiana. Something that changed what it meant to lose everything. He wasn't drowning out there, he was building, and the thing he was building was going to cost Ronald Stitt more than any of them could imagine standing at that fence. Dawn came in gray that April, the way it always does in the Willamette Valley, when the rain has been going too long, and the clouds have forgotten how to leave. Kenneth Moore stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He hadn't noticed. He was watching the lower field. The water was there again. Not the puddles he'd learnt to live with every spring. Not the standing pools that dried up by noon on a warm day. This was different. This was a lake where his winter wheat used to be, brown and flat and spreading out from the bank of Caldwell Creek, something that had made up its mind to stay. He set the mug down on the counter without looking at it. Walked to the back door, pulled on his boots in the dark of the mudroom, the left one first, the way he always did since the army. The right one second, with that half-second pause, while the knee reminded him it was still there. Pushed outside into the cold. The morning air smelled like wet earth and something older underneath it. Worms and clay, and the deep vegetable rot of things that had been submerged too long. He walked the 30 yards from the back porch to the field's edge without a flashlight, because he'd walked it 10,000 times and could have done it blind. He stopped at the fence post. The one Donna had painted white the first summer they were here. Back when painting fence posts felt like something worth doing. Back when everything felt like something worth doing. The water was up to the second rail. He stood there and let the fact of it settle into him the way cold settles into bone. 20 acres. His lower 20. The ground that had flooded twice before in 11 years, but never like this, never so early, never with such complete and indifferent authority. The creek had done what creeks do when you give them 9 days of rain and a good hard freeze the week before to pack the soil down hard and unabsorbent. It had stopped being a creek. It had become a decision. He'd known it was happening. Felt it coming the way farmers feel weather, not through instruments, but through some older sense that lives below the conscious mind, in the palms and the shoulder joints and the soles of the feet. He'd watched the creek level climb all week from his bedroom window and told himself it would peak and pull back. It didn't peak. It just kept coming, patient as arithmetic, until sometime in the night it made the final crossing and the lower field stopped being his field and became the creek's floor. The sky was getting lighter behind the ridge to the east. Not bright, just less dark. The kind of light that doesn't illuminate anything so much as it removes excuses for not seeing clearly. Kenneth looked at the water for a long time. 11 years he'd farmed this land. Came to it in the fall of 1993 with Donna and a truck that needed a new transmission, and a plan that was more hope than plan. She'd found the listing in a regional agricultural paper, circled it with a red pen, slid it across the breakfast table at their apartment in Grants Pass, with the look she always had when she'd already decided something and was just waiting for him to catch up. 40 acres in the Drayfield Valley, 2 creeks on the property line. A farmhouse built in 1952 that needed a new roof and new windows and new everything else, and 20 of the 40 acres in the low ground that flooded in wet years. He'd looked at the listing and said the thing he always said when something worried him. He'd said it slow. The words came out with the particular flatness of a man who has identified a problem and expects the identification to settle something. Those low acres are going to be a problem. Donna hadn't looked up from her coffee. Those low acres have potential. She said it the same way she said everything she believed completely. No emphasis, no persuasion. Just the fact, delivered flat, left on the table for him to pick up when he was ready. He'd learned over 12 years of marriage that this was how she operated. She didn't argue, she stated, and she waited. He picked it up. He always did. They bought the place in November, spent the winter, fixing what was fixable, and learning to live with what wasn't. Donna planted a kitchen garden in the spring that grew so well, the neighbors started stopping by to ask what she was putting in the soil. She told them compost and creek water and left out the part about how she talked to the plants, which he only knew about because he'd heard her out there. Some mornings before he came down for breakfast, having quiet one-sided conversations with things that were still just sticks in the ground. She had a way of knowing what things could become before they showed any evidence of becoming it. He'd thought about that a lot in the 2 years since she died. The diagnosis came in late February, 2 years ago. The kind of cancer that doesn't negotiate. 11 months of treatment, of driving to Portland and back, of sitting in waiting rooms, reading magazines he had no interest in, of watching Donna manage the whole thing with a practicality that scared him more than the disease did, because it meant she was already thinking past it. She made lists. She updated the farm's accounts and left them in a green folder in the second drawer of her desk with a sticky note that said for Kenneth. When? She organized things. She died in January, in their bedroom, with the window cracked the way she liked, even in winter, and the sound of Caldwell Creek running somewhere in the dark outside. It had been a cold night. The creek had been running low. The medical bills had taken most of what they'd saved over 11 years. Not all of it, but most. What was left sat in a checking account at Bell Valley Bank and covered the cost of one season's seed with a margin. Thin enough that looking at the balance gave him a feeling he associated with standing on ice and not being sure of the thickness. He was 58 years old. His right knee was held together by hardware installed at Fort Benning, Georgia in 1992 and the collective prayers of 2 orthopedic surgeons who told him he'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He'd proven them wrong about the limp, but only halfway, and only on good days. He had 40 acres in the Drayfield Valley, 20 of which were currently at the bottom of a temporary lake. He had a farmhouse that needed a new water heater. He had a son in Portland who called every 2 weeks with the specific kind of cheerful concern that means someone is worried but has run out of ways to say so. And he had, at this exact moment, enough money to buy one more season of seed and not much else. He turned away from the fence and walked back to the house. The coffee in the mug was stone cold by now, and he drank it anyway, standing at the counter with the kitchen light on and the window going gray outside. He had a habit of doing his worst thinking in the kitchen, at the counter, at hours when reasonable people were still asleep. Donna used to come downstairs sometimes and find him there, and not say anything, just put the kettle on and stand beside him. And somehow the thinking got better with another person in the room, even when neither of them spoke. The kitchen was very quiet. He rinsed the mug, put it in the rack, went upstairs and lay down on top of the covers in his work clothes, and stared at the ceiling until it got light enough to call it morning. Gary Whitmore came by at 8:30 with his truck and his perpetual expression of having already assessed a situation and found it worse than expected. He was 55 and had been farming the land adjacent to Kenneth's since before Kenneth moved to Drayfield, and he operated on a philosophy of complete transparency regarding bad news. He didn't soften things. He didn't offer alternative interpretations. He told you what he saw and waited to hear what you were going to do about it. He stood at the edge of the flooded field with his thumbs in the pockets of his canvas jacket and looked out over the water for a while. Then he said it plain as always, the words landing without cushion. That ground's gone for the year. You're not getting anything in there now. Not in soup. Kenneth stood next to him and didn't say anything. Water's going to sit 3-4 weeks minimum before it pulls back enough to even walk on. And when it does pull back, it's going to leave you 6 inches of silt that'll take all summer to dry out enough to work. Kenneth looked at the water. Still flat, still decided. You got the upper 20, Gary continued. That's something. Not enough to carry you through, not with what you've got coming out in interest. But it's something. You stew your spring planting up there and you keep your overhead low, and maybe at the end of the year you're not too far behind. The way he said not too far behind made it clear what behind meant. Stitt's going to come around, Gary said. It wasn't a question. He's been waiting on your low ground for 2 years. He'll make an offer that sounds reasonable and isn't. And the thing is, he stopped, looked sideways at Kenneth. The thing is, I'm not sure the offer's wrong. Kenneth looked at his neighbor. Gary shrugged. Not cruel. Just honest in the way that's sometimes crueler than cruelty. You're 60 shy of what you need to break even this year before it all went underwater. Now you're down to half your planting ground. You do the math. He went back to his truck after that. Didn't linger. Gary Whitmore had never lingered over a hard truth in his life. He delivered them and moved on, which was either a great quality or a terrible one depending on where you were standing. Kenneth stood at the fence for a while longer. The water had started to catch the morning light and it reflected the gray sky back at him in pieces. He thought about trout. Which was strange, because he hadn't thought about trout in 35 years. But standing there looking at 20 acres of water, his mind went sideways on him and landed on a memory from his second year in the Army, 1988, when his unit was sent to Fort Polk in Louisiana for a 2-week field exercise in the Kisatchie National Forest and the surrounding bottomland terrain. Survival skills in flooded delta country. Learning to read swamp topography, to build shelter on waterlogged ground, to find food in an environment that looked hostile but wasn't, not if you knew what you were looking at. There had been a local man, a civilian farmer named Beaumont, hired by the base to assist with the local terrain orientation portion of the exercise. Old man, 60-something, which had seemed ancient to Kenneth at 22. Boots so worn they'd shaped themselves permanently to his feet. Hat so faded you couldn't have said what color it started, as Beaumont had taken the unit out one morning into his own flooded fields. Not the training area. His actual farm, the low acres where the Cane River had come up in March and receded unevenly. There had been ducks on that water, dozens of them, moving across the surface in a loose and purposeful formation, their heads going under and coming back up with the industrious repetitiveness of something that has found its work and does not intend to stop. Kenneth had asked him what he was raising on flooded ground, and Beaumont had looked at him like the question was slightly backward. Son, he'd said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who has made his mistakes and learned from all of them. That ground's not flooding. That ground's working. He pointed out what the ducks were doing. Not swimming for recreation. Eating. Every dip of the head was a snail pulled from a drowned stalk, a larva extracted from the silt, an insect population reduced by some small but compounding degree. The feet underneath the water's surface were stirring the mud continuously, loosening it, introducing oxygen, breaking up the compaction that flood water created when it sat still. The droppings left behind were some of the most nutrient-dense organic fertilizer, available to a farmer who didn't have money for bags of the synthetic kind. And that? Kenneth had pointed to the far end of the field, where something green was growing in the shallow water. Actual plants, upright, thriving in conditions that should have killed them. Beaumont had looked at him for a moment with the patient expression of a man who has explained something many times. Rice, he said, wants exactly what you're looking at. Kenneth had filed it away. One of 10,000 things he'd learned in his years of service that had no application he could foresee, stored in the back of the mind where useless things go, waiting to either disappear or become relevant. 35 years. It had been waiting 35 years. He stood at his fence in Drayfield, Oregon, in April, and looked at 20 flooded acres, and felt the memory shift from background to foreground, with a kind of click he couldn't quite explain. He went inside and sat down at the kitchen table with a pad of paper. He spent the rest of that day, and the next two, doing what he privately called the math of a desperate man, which is different from ordinary math, because it starts from the answer you can barely afford to hope for, and works backward, checking each step for exits and finding fewer than you'd like. The upper 20 acres would produce, in a favorable season, enough to cover operating costs and service, maybe 60% of his outstanding debt. Not enough. The balloon payment on the farmhouse mortgage had been restructured after Donna's death, but the restructuring had a term. And the term was not infinite, and the clock on it had been running for 18 months. He could sell the lower 20 to Ronald Stitt he'd been offered. Stitt had come to him 14 months ago, with a folded piece of paper and a pen already uncapped, and the number on the paper had been low enough that declining it had been the easiest decision Kenneth had made that year. The lower 20, even in its current state, was worth more than Stitt's number. Maybe not by a lot, not in its flooded and troubled condition. But the offer had the shape of something that was counting on desperation to close the gap. If he sold now, Mr. David Cole, with the field underwater and the optics of the situation working against him, he might get enough to clear his immediate obligations and have enough left over to fund a much smaller operation on the upper 20. He'd be farming at half capacity for the foreseeable future. He'd be, as Gary had put it with his characteristic lack of ornament, not too far behind, which was another way of saying comfortably defeated. The alternative kept circling back to him. It sounded insane when he framed it plainly. He knew it sounded insane. He sat at the kitchen table and said it out loud, the way you sometimes need to do with the things that scare you, just to hear what they sound like, without the cushioning of your own interior voice. Duck, he was thinking about ducks. He called Daniel that night. His son picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been looking at his phone when it buzzed, which meant he was probably on his couch in Portland after work. Probably tired, probably doing the calculation of how much energy he had left to give to a conversation he suspected might be difficult. Daniel was 31 and worked in software and had an efficiency about his emotional energy that Kenneth recognized as something inherited, though not from him. "Hey, Dad. Hey, how's the field?" Kenneth looked at the window. Outside was dark, flooded, a pause. "How bad?" "Bad," another pause. "The lower 20? "Yeah. All of it?" "All of it." He heard Daniel exhale, not sharply, the slow kind, the kind that comes from somewhere that's been holding. "So the planting season is different than I planned." "Yeah. What are you going to do?" Kenneth looked at his notepad, the columns of numbers, the circles and arrows where he'd tried to make the math work in more than one direction. He'd thought about what to say and hadn't landed on a way to say it that sounded like anything except what it was. "I'm thinking about something," he said. "I need a few more days before I can explain it right." Daniel didn't push. That was one of the things about his son, one of the things that made Kenneth proud and sad in equal measure. "Okay," Daniel said. "Call me when you're ready, I will. Are you eating? You sound I'm eating." "Okay." Another pause. "I'm serious about the Portland thing, Dad. My apartment has a second room. You could." "I know you are," Kenneth said. "I appreciate it." He'd said the same thing the last 6 times Daniel had made the same offer. He appreciated it the same way he appreciated the idea of surrender, as something that existed, that was real, that someone had offered in good faith, and that he would not be taking. They said goodbye. He went back to his notepad. On the 3rd day, he called Gary. He asked Gary to come over after dinner, and Gary came, bringing 2 beers he'd clearly assumed the conversation would require. He sat across the kitchen table from Kenneth, and he listened. He listened for a long time, which was unusual for him, and he didn't interrupt once, which was even more unusual. When Kenneth finished, he picked up his beer and looked at the label on it for a moment, and then he put it back down. "You're talking about putting 300 ducks on your flooded field, I am, and growing rice, if I can source the seed. I've been making some calls. In Oregon." "In Oregon." Gary looked at him. His expression was the careful kind that means someone is deciding whether to be honest with you and has just decided yes. "Kenneth, you know I think well of you. I've thought well of you for 11 years. I want to be straight with you because of that." He put both hands flat on the table. "If you go spend your last money on a flock of ducks, people aren't just going to talk. They're going to have a point." Kenneth didn't say anything. "Stitt's offer is going to go away. He's patient, but he's not infinite. If you spend what you've got on this idea and it doesn't work, and rice in Drayfield is not a small ask, you're not going to have the option you have today." The kitchen light hummed. Through the window, somewhere out in the dark, Caldwell Creek ran over its new terrain with the indifferent sound of water that has found a channel and intends to keep it. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, his voice carrying something that wasn't quite certainty, but was in the same neighborhood. "You know what my sergeant used to tell us? About rivers. He'd say a river always wins the wrestling match. Every time, no exceptions. The only thing dumber than wrestling a river is doing it twice." He looked at Gary. "I've been trying to fight that ground for 11 years. The flood year in 2008, the wet spring of 2014, the drainage problem we never fully solved on the south end. Every time I treated it like a problem to be fixed, it beat me." Donna said it from the start. She said those acres have potential. I thought she meant potential as farmland. I think she meant something else. Gary picked up his beer again. He was quiet for a while. "What does this cost?" "The ducks are the big number. Seed I can maybe work out. I've been in correspondence with a researcher at Oregon State. He's excited to have a test case up here. He might be willing to provide seed against the promise of data. The ducks are the thing. How many?" 300. Gary looked at the ceiling. Back at Kenneth. 300 ducks. It's about scale. You need enough birds to work the acreage properly, to keep the pest load down, to turn the soil adequately. 50 ducks on 20 acres is a hobby. 300 ducks on 20 acres is an operation. Gary finished his beer, put it down, stood up, looked at the table for a moment the way men do when they've said what they came to say and have run out of new things to add. "I'll say this once more, and then I'll leave it. Think hard before you do this. Take the sure thing while you can still take it." After he left, Kenneth sat at the table for another hour. He thought about the sure thing. He held it up in his mind and looked at it from all the angles. Stitt's number on that piece of paper. The modest remainder after debts. The smaller operation on the upper 20. The apartment in Portland with the second room. The slow acceptable contracting of a life towards something manageable. He thought about Donna's voice saying, "Those low acres have potential." He thought about Beaumont on his flooded farm in Louisiana, pointing at ducks and rice like they were obvious answers to obvious questions, and the 22-year-old soldier from Grants Pass, who'd written it down in the back of his mind and promptly never thought about it again for 35 years. He got up, washed the 2 beer bottles, turned off the kitchen light, went upstairs and lay down again, but this time he slept. Ronald Stitt owned the largest farm in the Drayfield Valley, and, by extension, a significant portion of the opinions that circulated through it. He was 62, broad through the shoulders, and had the measured voice of a man who had learned long ago that he didn't need to be loud to be heard. He'd inherited the operation from his father, who had built it through methods that Margaret Finch could describe in detail if you asked her, and that nobody else in the valley had thought to ask about. Stitt wasn't a villain in the way of cartoons or simple stories. He was a villain in the way that most Valley Power actually operates, which is to say through patience, through relationships, ships with lending institutions, through the careful application of concern, in rooms where concern shapes opinion. He hadn't appeared at Kenneth's fence that April morning making threats. He'd stood at the far end of the road with his arms crossed and smiled, because smiling was sufficient. He could see the water from where he stood. He knew what the water meant. He was a man who understood that sometimes the river does the work for you. He had not gotten to be the most powerful farmer in Drayfield by being obvious about any of this. He'd gotten there by being reasonable. Every objection he raised was framed as common sense. Every concern he expressed was wrapped in the language of the community's well-being. It was a technique refined over decades, inherited and improved, and it had served him very well in a valley where the difference between influence and manipulation was largely a matter of who was narrating the story. He had been willing to wait for Kenneth Moore's situation to resolve itself in the natural direction of things. A widower with debt and flooded ground and no obvious path through the next 12 months was, in Stitt's assessment, a situation that required very little intervention. Time and arithmetic would do the necessary work. What he had not accounted for was 300 ducks and a memory from Louisiana. The Mill Haven livestock auction happened every second Thursday, and the Thursday that fell 11 days after Caldwell Creek took the lower field was cold enough that frost was still on the gate hinges when Kenneth drove the truck into the lot at 7:15 in the morning. The parking area was already half full. Pickup trucks and stock trailers, the smell of hay and animal and diesel, and the particular kind of mud that gathers wherever large numbers of people and animals occupy a gravel lot in wet weather. He'd driven the 40 minutes from Drayfield with his savings in a cashier's check in the interior pocket of his work jacket, next to his chest, where he was aware of it the whole way as a specific weight and warmth. He'd been deliberate about the cashier's check. If he'd brought the amount in cash, he might have looked at it on the seat beside him and turned the truck around. This way, it was already converted, already committed. The auction barn was large and cold, lit by overhead fluorescents that gave everything the washed-out quality of old photographs. The main pens held the stock that serious money came to buy. Cattle in several grades, a pen of Hampshire hogs, 3/4 horses and 1 roan that someone had priced aspirationally. The secondary pens at the back of the building held the remainder, the animals that arrived without pedigree or consistent breed, the chickens and rabbits, and the 2 emus someone had apparently entered on a dare. And in the last pen, tucked into the far back corner past the emus, contained behind a temporary wire fence that they'd been testing methodically since their arrival, 300 ducks. He stood at the fence for a while. The birds were a mixture of breeds, some runners with their upright posture and dark plumage, some obvious layers in the muted brown of cocky Campbells. Others less identifiable, the kind of agricultural miscellany that results when a flock has been allowed to follow its own reproductive preferences for a few generations. They were loud. They had opinions about the wire fence, and about the cold and about the presence of a man standing outside it looking at them. They communicated these opinions continuously. The other buyers in the building glanced at the duck pen the way people glance at something they've already decided is not their problem. The auctioneer was a compact man with a mustache, who ran the small lot section with the practiced speed of someone who wanted to get to lunch. He started the duck lot at a number low enough that he grimaced slightly when he said it, as though apologizing to himself for the circumstance. He paused. He looked around. He repeated the number. Somewhere in the middle distance, someone laughed. Not at the auctioneer. At the implied absurdity of the lot itself, 300 undistinguished ducks being offered to a room full of people who had come to buy cattle. Kenneth raised his hand. He said a number. The auctioneer blinked, twice. Then he did what auctioneers do when a bid comes in. He acknowledged it and paused in case someone wanted to counter. Nobody countered. Why would they? He looked at Kenneth for a moment across the heads of the small crowd. Then he brought his gavel down. The sound of it went through the room and didn't echo, just stopped. The laughter that followed was different from the laugh that came before the bidding. That one was brief and reflexive, the noise of mild absurdity. This one had edges to it. Knowledge. The story it would become by evening was already assembling itself in the minds of the people who'd witnessed it, each one thinking about who they'd call first. Kenneth walked to the payment window. The woman at the window was handling the record-keeping for the small lot section with the brisk efficiency of someone who does most things briskly and considers it a form of respect for everyone's time. She was 49, maybe, with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair, and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that expressions were for people with time to waste on them. She worked through his paperwork without looking up until she was done, and then she looked up. "You've done this before?" she asked, not rudely. Like someone double-checking a detail. Watched it done. Long time ago. She kept the receipt for a second before releasing it. "Where?" "Louisiana. Louisiana Delta Country. 1988. She let go of the receipt. She was quiet for a moment in the way that means a thought is completing itself. "My grandfather ran ducks on flooded bottomland. In West Tennessee, he used to say a duck was a farmer's hired hand that earns his pay in bugs." Kenneth looked at her. The badge on her jacket read Sharon Alcott. She said it matter-of-factly, as though offering a data point rather than making conversation. "People here won't understand it. They'll talk." A pause, minimal, If you need a second set of hands for setup, I'm at this window every second Thursday. I know my grandfather's system well enough to sketch out the basics. He thanked her, went to arrange the transport of 300 ducks. They came home in crates stacked in the bed of his truck and one borrowed utility trailer. The combined sound of them, rising above the road's noise for the entire 40-minute drive back to Drayfield, a noise that settled somewhere between complaint and declaration, and that he found himself listening to with the same attention he'd once given to engines he was responsible for keeping running. Drayfield knew before he got there. Word from Millhaven had made the phone calls it always makes, and by the time his truck came down the county road that ran past the edge of his property, there were trucks parked at Gary's fence and figures standing along the road's shoulder who hadn't been there that morning for any apparent reason. He recognized the truck that belonged to Martin, who farmed the south end of the valley. He recognized the profile of old Hector Brains, who'd stopped farming himself but retained an active interest in the farming of others. He saw, from the corner of his eye, the distinctive bulk of Ronald Stitt's black GMC pulled over on the far shoulder. He didn't stop. He drove the truck through his gate, down the lane, and to the edge of the flooded field. He opened the crates. He did it methodically, one at a time, working down the line of stacked crates without ceremony. He opened the wire door and stepped back and waited, and the bird inside made its decision, which took exactly no time at all. 300 ducks hit 20 acres of standing water like a statement being made. They didn't hesitate at the edge. They didn't slow to assess conditions or consider alternatives. They went into the water as though they'd been waiting for it their whole short lives, which perhaps they had. Within 4 minutes, the entire surface of the lower 20 was moving with them, a dispersal so complete and purposeful that it looked less like animals finding a body of water and more like a body of water coming alive. He stood at the fence. He could already see it happening. See Mr. David Cole. 2 ducks working together in a shallow channel, their heads going under in alternation, and when they came up, the motion told him everything he needed to know about what was in the water and what was being removed from it. A group of 6 near the far fence had found a concentration of snails in the silt and were working it with the focused energy of a crew that has identified a priority. The water was already subtly different. Not cleaner yet, not in any way you could measure in those first 4 minutes, but moving. Where it had been still and undifferentiated, it was now in motion, constantly interrupted, stirred from below by several hundred sets of feet, working independently but toward the same end. He stayed at the fence until the cold got past the point where staying made sense, and then he stayed a while longer. The people who'd gathered along the road had opinions. He could hear them from the fence line, not the words, just the tone. The particular register of community consensus being reached about something that has confirmed what the community already suspected. He heard Ronald Stitt's voice once, rising above the others just enough to be deliberate about it, saying something he'd designed to be overheard, the kind of remark that gets repeated and so doesn't need to be loud. He didn't turn around. He had work to do. The work of that first week was the work of learning what he should have learned before he'd made any decisions, except that there hadn't been time to learn it first, and so he was learning it alongside the consequences of not already knowing it. He was a farmer, not a waterfowl producer, and the overlap between those two things turned out to be both larger and smaller than expected. The coop took 3 days to build from lumber he'd had stacked in the barn for a project that never happened. He framed it low, near the high bank of the field where the ground stayed dry, with a wire enclosure wide enough to keep 300 birds without crowding them into the kind of density that creates its own problems. He ran a single strand of electric wire along the outer perimeter at ground level, 2 inches up, because the first 2 mornings he'd found evidence of something testing the fence in the night, and he couldn't afford to find out what it was the hard way. The ducks required management he hadn't anticipated. They were not, as he'd somehow imagined, self-organizing beyond a certain basic level. They needed to be moved to the coop at dusk, every dusk, and the trick was that they would follow a bucket of cracked corn with the discipline of soldiers following an order. but only if you established the pattern early and maintained it consistently. He worked this out by trial and error over 4 evenings, adjusting the height and the route until the movement became routine for them, until they were filing toward the coop at the first sign of fading light without needing the bucket at all. He found himself watching them with an attention he hadn't expected to give. There was a clarity to the work they did that he didn't have a good word for. Not instinct exactly. It was too specific, too adapted to the particular conditions of the flooded field. They seemed to understand the water in a way that was less about intellect and more about fit, the way a key fits a lock without knowing anything about it. What they did to the field in a single day was not something you could reduce to a list of individual actions. It was a system. The pest pressure went down. The soil structure at the water's floor began to change. The water itself. He tested it himself with a jar and a careful eye at the end of the first week. Was clearer than it had been when the flood first came in, despite having 300 animals in it all day. Donna's green folder was in the second drawer of her desk where she'd left it. He opened it on the 8th evening and sat with it under the desk lamp in the room she'd used as an office. The folder contained what she'd said it would, the farm's accounts, updated through the previous October, organized with a precision that gave him a specific kind of ache, the recognition of care applied to something small and practical, with the same attention you'd give to something large and important. A sticky note on the first page, her handwriting, the pen she'd always used, blue and slightly smudged at the edges of letters because she'd always held her pen at an angle, for Kenneth. When he sat with it for a while, then he opened the accounts and did the updated math with the new numbers, the reality of what the spring had become, and understood more clearly than he had before how narrow the margin was between where he stood and where this all fell apart. Sharon Alcott appeared at his gate on a Sunday morning 11 days after the auction. She arrived without announcement, which he'd learned was her way of doing things that mattered to her, directly. Without the ceremony of arrangement, she had a canvas bag with her and a thermos of coffee, and she walked the fence line with him in the kind of silence that doesn't require explanation. The silence of someone who is making an assessment and doesn't need to talk while doing it. She watched the ducks work for a long time. Then she nodded. Once. The slow kind that means something measured against memory and found to match. My grandfather kept about 40, she said. You've got 7 times that. You're going to be swimming in eggs before the end of the month. He told her he was already starting to see it. A week of production was already more than he knew what to do with. Sell them, she said, with the tone of someone identifying an obvious solution to an obvious problem. There's a hotel in Millhaven that buys eggs by the case. Harrow Inn, good kitchen, serious chef. There's a bakery on 5th Street that uses duck eggs specifically because of the fat content. They make a better crumb in their brioche. Higher ratio, richer emulsification. They pay a premium and nobody local is supplying them. He looked at her. You keep their books, I keep their books. She didn't soften it or expand on it. It was a fact, offered as a fact. I can put in a word, but you need to know how to do this right if you want repeat buyers. She taught him how to candle the eggs against a lamp to check viability. How to pack them in dry straw with enough separation to survive a 40-minute drive on county roads. How to maintain records a commercial buyer would trust, with batch numbers and production dates, and the name of the farm written at the top of the log in a hand, clear enough to read without glasses. She did it all in the same practical, unornamented way. She did everything, without making a performance of the knowledge or expecting gratitude for the transfer of it. He asked her, at one point, standing at the coop with the morning light coming in low and cold over the ridge, why she was spending her Sunday doing this. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the birds moving over the water. My grandfather was right about the ducks. Everybody told him it was a fool's system. He died before he got to hear anyone say he was right. She picked up her thermos. I'd rather not watch that happen twice. He didn't push it further. Some things are said once and mean exactly what they mean and don't require a response. He'd sent a letter to the agricultural extension at Oregon State in the second week after the auction. He'd sent a second letter to a seed supplier in Northern California, whose catalog listed experimental cold climate grain varieties. He'd been given a name, Timothy Goss, a researcher at a small agricultural institute in the Willamette Valley who'd been working on modified rice cultivars for the past 8 years and was, from what Kenneth could tell, doing most of this work in a state of cheerful isolation, because nobody else in the Pacific Northwest was particularly interested in growing rice. Goss called him back on Wednesday afternoon and talked for 45 minutes without much prompting. The voice of a man who has been waiting for a phone call like this and is not going to waste it. He asked specific questions about the depth of the flooding, the creek's flow rate, the soil composition of the lower 20, the drainage profile of the field's high side. At the end, he said that what Kenneth was describing sounded like exactly the test environment he'd been trying to find for 3 seasons, and that if Kenneth was willing to share his data through the growing period, he'd provide the seed on a research basis arrangement that required no cash outlay from Kenneth's end. Kenneth stood at the kitchen window while Goss talked. Outside, the lower field moved constantly with birds. He said, "What's the realistic outcome here? If this works?" Goss had taken a moment before answering, which meant he was being careful about the answer rather than optimistic about it. Sapietes. If the variety performs the way it's performed in controlled conditions, and if your duck population is doing what you're describing to the soil biology, and if the summer gives you what the forecast models suggest, you could be looking at a yield per acre that competes with anything else you're growing on that land. More to the point, you're growing it on ground that would otherwise produce nothing this season. Kenneth processed this, and if it doesn't work, then you have very well-maintained flooded ground and a large number of healthy ducks and a much better understanding of the variables involved, which is also valuable. A pause, then quieter. But I think it works. I've been waiting for someone to try this in Oregon for 3 years. I don't think. I've called the wrong farmer. The seed arrived in a burlap sack at the end of May, with 2 handwritten pages of instruction tucked inside it. Kenneth read those pages 11 times over 4 days, not because they were difficult, but because he wanted to understand them from multiple angles, the way you study terrain before you move across it. He made notes in the margins. He drew a rough diagram of the field with the prevailing water depth marked in zones and planned the seeding accordingly. He waded into the field on a Tuesday morning in early June while the ducks parted around him in the offended way of something that has decided a large space belongs to it and resents the intrusion. The water was shallow enough now that he could move through it without difficulty, his boots finding the bottom reliably. He carried the seed in a canvas bag across one shoulder and broadcast it across the water's surface with the slow, even-armed motion that Goss had described in his instructions, letting the current and the natural distribution of the field's topology carry the seed to its settling places. It was strange work. Nothing in his farming history had prepared him for the specific strangeness of seeding a field he couldn't see, of committing something to ground that was currently submerged, of performing an act of agricultural faith in conditions that looked, to any sensible observer, like the opposite of a suitable growing environment. He did it anyway. On the 14th day after seeding, he was at the fence before dawn with a flashlight. He played the beam across the water slowly, section by section, looking for what Goss's notes said to look for. He found it. Green. The very specific green of something new and alive, thin as a needle at this stage, emerging at the water's surface in scattered clusters across the field's midsection, where the seeding had been densest. Not everywhere, not yet, but there unmistakably, against the gray dawn light that was just beginning to separate itself from the dark, rice, growing in an Oregon flood field. He stood at the fence, with the flashlight going warm in his hand, and let the sight of it do whatever it was going to do to him. And what it did was not straightforward. It wasn't the simple satisfaction of a plan working. It was more specific than that, and harder to name. It had to do with Donna's green folder and the sticky note that said for Kenneth, when. It had to do with an old man named Beaumont standing in a flooded Louisiana field in 1988, pointing at ducks like they were obvious. It had to do with 2 years of mornings alone in the kitchen and the particular quality of silence in a house where someone isn't anymore. He stayed at the fence until the light was good enough to see the whole field clearly. 300 ducks moved across 20 acres of standing water below a ridge in the Drayfield Valley in early June. And in the silt beneath their feet, and through the stirred water above it, and in the thin green light of something new, coming up through the surface, a partnership was happening that he would have been hard-pressed to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it. He went inside and called Sharon Alcott. She picked up on the third ring, already awake, already somewhere in the middle of something. He said, "The rice is up." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'll be there in an hour." He hung up, put the kettle on, stood at the window watching the field come into the morning light. The water was moving, the green was there, the ducks were working, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where old soldiers' wisdom goes to wait for its moment, his sergeant's voice said what it had always said about rivers. The river always wins the wrestling match. Don't wrestle it. He was done wrestling. June arrived the way good things arrive when you've stopped watching for them, quietly, without announcement, in the early hours before anyone was awake to note it. Kenneth noticed the change first in the quality of the morning light. The gray that had sat over Drayfield since April began to break apart in the first week of June, coming undone at the edges, peeling back to show the kind of blue that makes the valley look like a painting of itself rather than the real thing. The ridge to the east caught the sunrise differently now, the way it does when moisture is leaving the air and something drier and warmer is replacing it. Farmers read light the way sailors read water. Kenneth read it and felt, for the first time since the flood, something that was not quite optimism but was adjacent to it, a directional feeling. A sense of the calendar moving in a useful direction. The lower field had changed. Not the water level. That was still high enough that the ducks moved through it rather than over it. The surface of the 20 acres still reflecting sky rather than showing soil. But the quality of the place had shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to miss. Where the floodwater had arrived brown and turbid and carrying the suspended debris of everything the creek had swept up along its swollen banks, it was now clearing from the center outward. The silt settling into patterns on the bottom that you could see from the fence on a still morning. The ducks had been at the surface continuously for 6 weeks, and the result was water that behaved differently from standing water, that had the character of something maintained rather than something abandoned. And in the water shallower zones, in the gradients where depth shifted from ankle level to shin level to knee level, moving away from the bank, the rice was up in earnest now. It had taken its time. The first emergence had been tentative in the way young things are tentative, those thin green needles, pushing through the surface film, with the uncertainty of something that hasn't confirmed yet whether the world outside is worth the trouble of entering. By the third week, the tentativeness was gone. The plants had made their assessment and found the environment acceptable, and were growing with the quiet confidence of organisms in their preferred conditions. Yes, they stood in loose rows across the center of the field, where Kenneth had seeded most densely, irregular to look natural, numerous enough that from the fence they formed a green haze over the water's surface, a color that had no business being in an Oregon flood field in June and was there regardless. The ducks did not eat the rice. This was the thing that Kenneth had known intellectually from Beaumont's demonstration and from Goss's notes and from the agricultural literature he'd been reading in the evenings. But that he found, when actually watching it happen, still quietly astonishing. 300 waterfowl moving through a field of young plants and not eating those plants. They would eat everything else in the water. They had eaten systematically and without remainder the entire population of water snails that had been living in the flooded soil. They had reduced the mosquito larvae to a level that made the field's surface, in the mornings when the light was low and Kenneth scanned it carefully, noticeably clearer of the larval wriggle he'd expected. They ate aquatic insects and floating organic debris and algae that would have blocked light from the rice's growing tips. They ate everything they were supposed to eat and left the rice alone, guided by some biological instructions that didn't require Kenneth's intervention or approval. He found himself watching them the way you watch something you don't fully understand but have decided to trust. The decision had been made. The money was spent and the seed was in. What remained was the watching. Sharon came every Sunday now, and she had stopped pretending it was purely a professional visit, sometime around the third week of the arrangement, when she brought a thermos of coffee without being asked, because she'd concluded he wouldn't think to make any. And she was right. She walked the fence with him and looked at the field, and asked specific questions about the water temperature and the plant density, and whether he'd noticed any variation in the duck behavior near the rice zones. She was building a picture of something the way she built accounts, systematically, adding one verified number at a time until the whole figure was readable. She had started bringing her grandfather's notes. They were in a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, held together with a rubber band that had been replaced so many times the original band's ghost was still visible, as a slight compression in the paper's edge. The handwriting inside was small and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who'd been taught penmanship when it was still considered a discipline. She didn't offer the notebook to him. She referred to it herself, consulting it the way you consult a reference that you've more or less memorized but want the authority of the original to back you up. The margins of her grandfather's fields, he'd noted, were where the real surprise came in. Sharon pointed this out during the fourth Sunday visit, standing at the fence corner where the low field's edge met the slight rise of the bank, the zone where the water had never been deep enough to establish itself permanently and had retreated first, leaving a band of ground that was wet enough to call muddy, but dry enough to walk on without sinking. The soil there had a different quality. You could see it. The color was darker, richer, the deposit of weeks of silt-heavy water, laying down its cargo along the edge as it receded, the way a river builds its banks with what it carries. The organic material was concentrated there, in a way that most farmers would spend money trying to create artificially. Greens, she said, looking at the bank with the directness she applied to anything worth paying attention to. Your margins will grow salad greens in that soil, faster than anything you've planted on the upper field. Lettuces, chard, mustard greens, they want the moisture without the inundation. That's exactly what you have. He looked at the bank. He looked back at her. Brian Culver at the Harrow Inn. She'd mentioned the executive chef before, in the context of the egg account she'd helped establish. He's been asking me about local produce for 6 months. He sources from a wholesaler in Salem, and he hates it. He wants relationships with farms he can put on the menu. He wants to write the county name, not the distributor's name. Kenneth understood what she was suggesting, and understood also that she was right, without needing to take time to think about it. He planted the margins in the third week of June. Lettuces first. 4 varieties he sourced from the feed store in Millhaven. Then 2 rows of chard along the wetter edge, where the water still pooled sometimes after rain. The chard went into ground so dark and rich, it smelled like something between a forest floor and a garden that has been loved for generations. He planted without much confidence and was surprised, 2.5 weeks later, to be standing at the field's edge looking at growth rates he'd never achieved on his upper 20 in 11 years of trying. The silt had been doing its work. The field he'd mourned in April had become, without asking for his opinion, exceptionally fertile ground. He loaded his first delivery of eggs and greens together into the truck bed on a Tuesday morning in early July, the eggs in straw-packed cartons that Sharon had sourced from a supplier in Hillsborough, the lettuce in paper bags that Brian Culver had requested, specifically on the grounds that he disliked the way plastic changed the smell of cut greens. The drive to Millhaven took 40 minutes, and Kenneth made it in the particular mental state of someone delivering something they've made with their own hands to a stranger who has agreed to pay for it, but hasn't actually paid for it yet, which is a state combining professional confidence with the suspicion that something is about to go wrong. Nothing went wrong. Brian Culver came out from the kitchen himself to look at the lettuces, and he did something Kenneth hadn't expected, which was to pick up a head of the butter lettuce, peel back the outer leaves, and smell the inner leaves with the focused attention of a man testing something against an internal standard. He did this for several seconds. Then he put it down and looked at Kenneth with a new quality of regard, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who has made up his mind cleanly. "I'll take everything you bring me, all of it, every week. Whatever this is, whatever you're putting in that soil, don't change it." Kenneth didn't explain what was in the soil. He just said he'd be back next Tuesday. Sandra Morvell at the bakery on 5th Street was quieter about her enthusiasm, but no less definitive. She'd been buying the duck eggs since mid-June and had already restructured 2 of her regular recipes around them without telling Kenneth she was doing it. She told him this on a Tuesday in July when she came out to the truck with her weekly check and mentioned, almost incidentally, that her Saturday brioche had been getting specific comments from customers asking what had changed, and that she'd decided she preferred not to answer the question because she didn't want any of her competitors to get the same idea. Kenneth drove back to Drayfield each Tuesday with money in his account that hadn't been there the Tuesday before. Not the amounts that cleared his situation, but directional amounts, purposeful amounts, money that was going somewhere rather than plugging holes. He started a separate log, in a new notebook, spiral-bound, nothing like Donna's composition books. He'd been careful about that. Tracking the weekly receipts against the mortgage balance, and in the pending balloon payment that was now 14 months out on its restructured timeline. He was running out of the 14 months faster than he'd run out of the season. The arithmetic, which he performed at the kitchen table most evenings, with the same notepad and the same deliberateness, showed him something he didn't particularly want to see but couldn't look away from. The egg and greens. Income was reducing his debt service load at a rate that would matter by November, that would matter significantly by the following spring, that would, if the rice came in the way Goss's projections suggested, matter enormously by fall of the coming year. He was building something real. The foundation was being laid in a way he could see in the numbers. The rice wouldn't come in by August. It would take through September into October if the season cooled early. And the balloon payment, under the terms of the mortgage restructuring, came due in August. He'd known this. He'd always known this. He'd built his plan with this knowledge, the way you build around a structural column. You incorporate it. You work with it. You don't pretend it isn't there. The plan had been to have the rice income land first, to use the harvest receipts to clear the balloon, to arrive at that due date with the field already in and enough cash in hand to satisfy the bank's requirements. The plan had assumed a normal growing season. The flood had cost him 6 weeks. The envelope from Bell Valley Bank arrived on a Thursday in the first week of August, and he set it on the counter without opening it for most of the day because he recognized the envelope's character. The kind that contains information delivered in careful professional language and was occupied with more immediate tasks, specifically the matter of building a second shelter extension for the ducks after a portion of the original structure had shown weakness in a stress point he'd underestimated when he framed it. He dealt with the structure. He came inside at 4 in the afternoon. He opened the envelope. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The bank regretfully informed him that, pursuant to the terms of the restructuring agreement dated the previous January, the outstanding balance on his farm mortgage, a number they printed clearly in the middle of the page, in a font that seemed slightly larger than the surrounding text, as though to ensure there was no possibility of misreading it, was required to be paid in full within 30 days of the letter's date. 30 days. He put the letter on the table. He sat down. He did the arithmetic again, with the letter beside the notepad, though he already knew what the arithmetic would say. The number in the letter was not a number he had. It was not a number he could produce in 30 days from any source available to him. The rice wasn't in. The rice wouldn't be in for 6 weeks at minimum. He had built a bridge across a gap and discovered the gap was wider than the bridge, and the discovery came at the exact moment when turning around was no longer an option. He sat at that table for a long time. The ducks settled into their coop at dusk with their customary orderliness, guided by habit now rather than incentive, and the sound of 300 birds going quiet is a sound that starts as a kind of layered murmuring and then decreases in stages, individuals finding their settling positions, the collective voice dropping register by register until it becomes something close to silence. He listened to it through the window. He looked at the letter. Ronald Stitt had not been idle through the summer months. He'd watched the egg deliveries begin from the distance, available to a neighbor with a long driveway, and no particular reason to come closer. He'd heard the reports from Brian Culver's kitchen, which reached him the way. Everything in a small valley, eventually, reaches the people who pay attention to such things, through the lateral movement of information across the counter, at the feed stores, and the gas station, and the Grange parking lot on meeting nights. He'd heard about the margins, about the greens, about the agricultural extension officer who'd driven out and spent half a day at the fence with a notebook, and Stitt. Being a patient and methodical man, had gone to Bell Valley Bank in July, with the specific kind of social call that isn't listed in anyone's appointment book, but that changes the shape of decisions made in rooms you're not invited into. He had history with the bank's senior officer. Not friendship exactly, because Stitt didn't maintain friendships so much as he maintained relationships with people whose usefulness he'd assessed and found sufficient. He had deposits there. His father had had deposits there. The accumulated weight of that relationship was a thing he spent carefully. And only when necessary. He'd raised the matter of Kenneth Moore's restructured mortgage in the concerned and reasonable tone he'd perfected over 30 years of concerned and reasonable conversations. He'd mentioned the flooded ground, the unconventional methods, the speculative nature of a rice crop on Oregon farmland. He'd mentioned the word risk several times, in different constructions. The way you work a phrase into a room's thinking without seeming to be doing it deliberately. He'd left without asking for anything directly. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Sharon read it at Kenneth's kitchen table on Sunday. Reading it twice the way she read documents, she was trying to understand all the way through, not just the first layer but the implications under it. When she put it down, her expression had a flatness to it that he'd come to recognize as the surface manifestation of active thought rather than absence of feeling. She said what he already knew, her voice carrying no surprise because she'd seen this mechanism before from closer than Kenneth realized. This is Stitt. He didn't disagree. He has influence with that bank. Specific, structural influence. I keep the accounts for 3 of their largest depositors, and I know how the relationships work. She turned the letter over and set it face down on the table, a small act of refusal. He waited until your harvest was close enough to be real, and then he moved to take it at the moment it has the most value. It's the same play his father ran in 1961. Different instruments, same mechanism, Kenneth said. You knew about the father, Margaret Finch told me. 2 summers ago, when Stitt first started making noises about your lower acres. She said, watch how this develops. It develops the same way it always has. He looked at the window. Evening light on the field, the rice standing now in earnest density across the water, the heads beginning to form at the tops of the plants, still green, weeks from gold, but there, real, provable. Goss had driven out the previous week and walked the fence, line saying nothing. For Twenevy he'd turned to Kamenetz with expression that combined scientific satisfaction with the specific relief of a man who has been right about something important for a long time and has finally found the evidence. I want to go to Price, Kenneth told her. Edward Price. The agricultural extension officer who'd stood at his fence with a notebook for 2.5 hours in July and taken samples and asked questions and said, before he got back in his state vehicle, that if this rice came in the way it was looking, he intended to write it up for the state agricultural bulletin. The Willamette Valley Extension Service had a fund for exactly this kind of thing. New agricultural methods demonstrating regional viability. A bridge loan mechanism designed for situations where a promising operation needed short-term capital against a documented projected yield. Sharon said without softening it, Price as at a conference in Salem. He won't be back for 3 weeks. The arithmetic of that was immediate and brutal. 3 weeks put Price's return a week before the letter's deadline. Not enough time to process a funding application, not under any bureaucratic timeline he'd ever encountered, not without extraordinary circumstance, and the cooperation of people who had no particular reason to hurry. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Sharon waited. She was good at waiting, the kind of waiting that isn't passive, but is itself a form of pressure, a held space that expects something to fill it. If Price can't move fast enough, he said finally, "What's left?" She looked at him with the directness she usually reserved for numbers that didn't add up. "The Grange," she said. Thursday. The Agricultural Society's summer meeting. Every farmer in this valley who has a stake in how things go around here will be in that room. She let that sit. Price isn't the only authority. He's just the easiest one. He drove out to Caldwell Creek that evening, not to look at it. It was running low now, reduced to its usual summer self, the April version already seeming impossible from this distance. But because he needed to be somewhere that wasn't the kitchen and the options that were constricting in it. He sat on the bank with his boots in the grass and let the sound of the water replace the arithmetic for a while. He thought about Sergeant Bellard, 23 years in the army, and a voice like a man who'd long since stopped bothering to perform certainty because he'd earned the actual thing. Bellard had died in a training accident 4 months after the Louisiana deployment, which meant he'd been dead for 37 years and somehow kept talking, which was either a testament to the durability of a good idea or a feature of the way loss works, how the people you've learned from become the people you've learned from, a kind of permanent internal resource that you draw from, without thinking, and then one day you're 58, and standing at the edge of everything you've built, and you realize you've been having a conversation with a dead man for most of your adult life, and the conversation has been, on balance, useful. The river always wins the wrestling match. He'd done the other thing. He'd worked with the land rather than against it, turned the flood into a system instead of a crisis, let the water be what it wanted to be while he built something alongside it rather than fighting it. He'd done the wise and counterintuitive thing, and it had worked. And now, he was about to lose the land anyway because of a different kind of current, the kind that moves through banks and county boards and conversations in feed stores. And he'd been trying to navigate that current alone, the same way he tried to navigate everything alone, by thinking harder and sitting at the kitchen table later and not asking anyone for anything that felt like a concession. He sat on the creek bank and let himself understand something he'd been close to for weeks but hadn't looked at directly. The land had taught him to stop fighting it. The land had not yet finished teaching. The lesson that was still outstanding was not about farming. It was about the other thing, the thing Donna had always understood, and he had always been slower to reach, the thing she'd been practicing from their first year in Drayfield, when she brought casseroles to sick neighbors without consulting him and organized the seed-sharing cooperative with 3 other farms, and knew the name of every person within 2 miles of their property and the name of their children and their children's ages. She had understood in her practical and unceremonious way that a farm was not just soil and water and seed. It was a place in a community, and a community was the thing that caught you when the arithmetic ran out. He had been trying to run the farm she'd built without running the human infrastructure she'd built it on. The problem with being a man who had spent his adult life doing things himself, who had survived 12 years of military service, who had built a farm from near nothing, who had sat with his wife through her dying, and kept the machinery of the place running through the grief that followed, is that you develop a relationship with self-sufficiency that begins as a practical tool and ends up resembling a point of pride that you mistake for character. He'd been sitting at his kitchen table every night, running the same numbers through the same arithmetic, and arriving at the same insufficient answer and telling himself he was thinking hard enough. He wasn't thinking harder. He was thinking alone. There is a difference. And sitting on the bank of Caldwell Creek, with the August evening going blue and cool around him, he understood that the meeting at the Grange Hall on Thursday was not about the Agricultural Society's lending mechanisms or Edward Price or any particular financial instrument. It was about going into a room full of people he'd lived next to for 11 years and asking for something. Just asking, without the armor of self-sufficiency, without the maneuvering of a man looking for the option that doesn't require his pride to be involved. He went home, looked at the calendar, looked at the letter. 23 days. He went upstairs and slept like a man who has made a decision, which is its own kind of rest, not easy but deep. Daniel called on a Friday evening in that second week of August, not his usual every 2 weeks timing, which meant Gary had called him first. Kenneth recognized the shape of the call before it was 3 sentences in. The specific quality of concern that has been recently activated by information received from a third party and is now presenting itself as natural curiosity. Gary mentioned things are a little complicated with the bank. A little. He said there was a letter, He could hear Daniel processing this. The particular silence of a 31-year-old who has been worried about his father for 2 years and has just found a new specific thing to be worried about. How much time? 3 weeks now. Down from 30 days. And the rice, 6 weeks out. Minimum. A longer pause. Dad, the way he said it carried the full weight of what he meant, which was, I've been telling you. I've been offering. I've been sitting in Portland trying to be respectful of your choices while those choices get harder, and I am very close to running out of respectful ways to watch this happen. Kenneth said, I know. I have some savings. I've been putting away since. It's not a lot, but it's something. Maybe 2 months of breathing room if it's structured right. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you get that kind of savings on a software salary in Portland? I've been careful. A pause that carried its own weight. I've been thinking about this for a while. He understood, in that moment, something he hadn't understood before about his son, about what Daniel had been doing in the 2 years of every other week phone calls and careful offers of the spare room and the specific quality of restraint he'd maintained, even when the restraint clearly cost him something. Daniel had not been keeping his distance. He'd been keeping his resources. He'd been holding something in reserve for exactly this kind of moment. And the only reason Kenneth hadn't seen it was that he'd been too occupied with his own form of preparation to notice his son doing the same thing. He said, I appreciate it, Daniel. I really do. But I'm going to try one more thing first. He heard Daniel exhale. Not frustrated. The sigh of someone who knows what the answer will be and knows also that he can't want the outcome more than his father does. What's the thing? I'll tell you about it Thursday. Come down Thursday. A pause. You're going somewhere Thursday. We're going somewhere Thursday. He hung up and sat for a while longer by the window. Outside, the ducks were making their evening procession toward the coop without his involvement. The pattern so established, now that they didn't need him to direct. He watched them move and thought about how long it takes for a thing to become reliable, and how reliability is the thing that makes everything else possible, and how you can't rush it, only maintain it, one evening at a time. The week before the Grange meeting had its own texture, distinct from the weeks that preceded it. He worked the farm during the days with the heightened attention of someone who is cataloging, rather than merely maintaining, noting the exact state of the rice heads, measuring the margin greens against his records, watching the duck population with a sharpness that was partly care and partly witness. He wanted to know the full truth of what he had, not the optimistic truth, not the worried truth, the actual thing, as completely as he could see it. He called Goss on Monday morning and asked him to describe, as precisely as his research warranted, what the Drayfield field was likely to yield under current conditions and realistic assumptions. Goss answered for 20 minutes, cautious in the scientific way but not pessimistic. The variety was performing. The soil biology data Kenneth had been sending him weekly showed a trajectory that Goss described as better than the best case I modeled, and the duck population had done exactly what the theory said it would do to the soil composition. The yield projection, if the summer held, could be the most convincing regional demonstration of integrated duck rice cultivations he'd seen outside of a controlled research environment. Kenneth wrote this down, word for word, and put the paper in his jacket pocket. He sat with Sharon Tuesday evening, at her kitchen table, which was smaller than his and covered in the same kind of organized paperwork that indicated a mind that worked with numbers the way carpenters work with wood, specifically, without waste. She laid out the records she'd been maintaining, the egg receipts and the greens receipts, and the trajectory of income growth over the 14 weeks since the operation began, the month-over-month increase. The projected figures for the fall if the rice harvest arrived, as Goss suggested it would. She said, with the precision of someone who has read a room before it assembles. When you stand up Thursday, you need to show them two things. First, what you've built. Second, what it will produce. The second number is the one that does the work. People invest in the future, not the past. He asked her to come with him. She looked at the table for a moment before she looked at him. Of course, she said, as though it weren't a question, as though it had already been decided some time ago, and this was just the official notation of a fact already in the record. He drove to the Grange Hall on Thursday, with Daniel in the passenger seat, and Sharon following in her own car, because she'd driven herself to things for long enough that it had become a preference rather than a circumstance. The parking lot was filling up when they arrived. Agricultural Society summer meetings drew the full complement in Drayfield, partly because there was legitimate business to conduct, and partly because there wasn't so much other entertainment on a Thursday evening in August that people needed much reason to gather. He saw Gary's truck, he saw Martin's and Brains's, and half a dozen others he recognized. He saw Ronald Stitt's black GMC parked at the far end of the lot, which was not a surprise. He sat in the truck for 30 seconds with the engine off. Daniel looked at him, not saying anything, just looked. Kenneth said, something releasing in his chest as the words came out. Your mother would find this very funny. Daniel thought about that. She'd find it hilarious. She'd also have been here 3 hours early with a sign-in sheet. He got out of the truck. Sharon was already at the door with her ledger under her arm and the expression of a woman who has read every number twice and is not nervous about what they say. He fell in beside her, and they went in together, which was not a strategic decision, but felt in the moment like one. The hall was warm with people, and the smell of coffee from the industrial urn in the corner, and the specific acoustic quality of a room full of farmers who have things to discuss. Paul Albright, the society's chairman, was at the front table with his reading glasses and the evening's agenda in front of him. A man who ran these meetings with the economy of someone who considers their time, and everyone else's, a resource to be managed. Kenneth went to the back of the hall at first. Old habit. He'd been a back-of-the-room presence at Grange meetings since the first one he attended in 1994, which was partly temperament and partly the legitimate newcomer's deference to people who'd been in the valley longer than he had. He stood there for a few minutes while the meeting was called to order, while the minutes of the previous meeting were reviewed and approved, while the first 3 items of business were dispatched with Albright's customary efficiency. And then he picked up the canvas bag with the burlap covering it and walked to the front. He asked Albright for a few minutes. Albright looked at the room, looked at Kenneth, nodded. He set the bag on the front table and peeled back the burlap. Inside was a bundle of rice. He'd cut it that morning, from the warmest corner of the lower 20, the section that had seeded earliest and had the longest growing period. The heads were not fully golden. The field at large was still 3 to 4 weeks from true harvest readiness. But this corner had moved faster, and the bundle he held up in the fluorescent light of the Grange Hall showed heads that were heavy and densely filled, already beginning to yellow at the tips, unmistakably a grain crop in its final approach to maturity. The room went through the specific sequence that rooms go through when they encounter something they don't have a category for. The initial silence. The movement of information through the space as people in the front communicated to people in the back. The gradual transition from uncertainty to engagement as the physical object made its way from hand to hand along the front row. Rice, in Oregon, in a Drayfield field that the entire county had spent the spring dismissing as a casualty of the season. He told it the way he always told things, which was plainly, starting from the facts and building outward. The flood in April. The choice he'd made at the fence line that first morning. The ducks and what they'd done to the field's biology over 4 months. The rice from Timothy Goss's research program. The cultivar adapted for exactly the temperature and moisture conditions Drayfield's lower valley could offer in a wet year. The margins with their greens. The egg account with Harrow Inn, and the bakery relationship Sharon had built for him in the first month. He held up the notebook where he'd been logging the income. He said Sharon's name and she stood, briefly, from where she'd taken a seat at the side of the room, and several people who knew her name and knew what it meant when she put her numbers behind. Something adjusted their posture, almost imperceptibly. Then he said the hard part. He said it without looking at Stitt's position at the front of the room, which required a specific kind of discipline. He said, the balloon payment was due in 23 days. He said, the harvest was 6 weeks out. He said, he was asking the society if the New Methods Fund could function as a bridge against a documented projected yield, with the rice crop and the ongoing income from eggs and greens as the security, and Edward Price's forthcoming write-up in the State Bulletin as the independent verification of the method's validity. The silence after he finished was a different kind than the one before. Denser, loaded with the weight of a room doing its arithmetic at once. Ronald Stitt stood up. He was a good speaker, which was always his advantage, and he knew how to frame objections in the language of common sense and collective prudence. He got as far as 3 sentences into the framing. The unproven nature of the method, the speculative quality of the rice yield, the risk to the fund's resources from lending against agricultural projections that hadn't materialized. Before George Dillard stood up from the 3rd row. George Dillard was 71 and had been on the county agricultural board for 14 years and had the physical presence of a man who has been sitting at the front of rooms. Long enough that his presence there requires no announcement. He'd been at the field inspection in July. He'd walked the fence line himself. He'd held the net that Sharon had used to demonstrate the larval count in the field water. He said, his voice carrying with the particular authority of someone who has earned the right to settle arguments. I went out to that field. Official capacity. We went expecting problems. We found the cleanest water I've seen on agricultural land in this valley all summer. He turned slightly so his voice carried to the back of the room. My father raised ducks on bottom land in Alabama. I told him it was old-fashioned. He was right, and I was wrong, and I've been wrong about it for 50 years. He turned back to the front. I suggest we stop being wrong. The room moved. Brian Culver had come to the meeting. He attended most community meetings in the area as a matter of professional relationship management, meaning he liked knowing what was happening and who was doing it. And he stood when Dillard sat down and said that he had been buying from Kenneth Moore's operation since June and had personally committed his kitchen to that relationship and would commit it further if the operation continued and could supply what a serious restaurant kitchen required at volume. Sandra Morville said something similar from the other side of the room, shorter and more pointed, in the manner of someone who has made her decision and sees no reason to elaborate on it. Gary Whitmore stood up last, before Albright called the question. He stood the way he always stood, with his thumbs in his jacket pockets, and his expression arranged in the direction of complete honesty without performance. He said, his voice unhurried and carrying to the back wall, I told this man to take the safe option. I said people would have a point about him spending his last money on ducks. A pause. I've watched myself be wrong about that, every week for 4 months. He looked at the table where Albright was doing his calculations. I'll put up against my own ground to cover whatever the fund can't reach. I've farmed next to Kenneth Moore for 11 years. I'd rather stake that than any safe option. The vote wasn't a vote so much as a consolidation of what the room had already decided. Albright tallied the fund's available capacity, which covered most of the balloon payments amount with a margin that Gary's pledge bridged. The paperwork that Sharon had brought, the income records, the projected yield figures with Goss's technical summary attached, the purchase commitments from Culver and Morville, signed and dated, was sufficient for the society's documentation requirements. Daniel had been sitting against the wall near the back of the room. Kenneth hadn't looked at him during the presentation. He looked at him now. His son had his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly, the specific expression of someone watching something he needs a moment to absorb. He caught his father's eye and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said. Stitt left before the business concluded. He went without making a scene because making a scene was never his method, and because a man who operates through quiet influence does not announce his reversals. He walked out through the side door with the same unhurried quality he'd walked in with, and the room let him go without marking it. Kenneth stood foot at the front table while Sharon organized the paperwork, and Albright went over the terms of the bridge arrangement, and Gary talked to Dillard about something that required both of them to look at a point approximately 6 feet to the left of Kenneth's head. He held the bundle of rice loosely in one hand, not displaying it, not holding it up, just holding it the way you hold something you've been carrying for a long time and have arrived somewhere with. Outside, the August evening was cooling toward the specific temperature. That means summer is still here, but fall is on its way, and both things are true simultaneously. The ridge to the east would be dark against the last of the light. The lower field would be quiet, the ducks in their coop and the rice standing in the shallow water without anyone to witness it, growing because that was what it was doing what it had been doing since the first thin needles broke the surface in early June. Indifferent to the opinion of the valley, Margaret Finch appeared at his elbow as the room was emptying. She was 72 and moved with the precise economy of someone who has decided not to waste what's left of her physical resources on unnecessary motion. She had been sitting in the back row throughout the meeting, which he'd registered without quite noting, and now she was beside him with the directness of someone who came with a specific purpose and intended to deliver it. She said, her voice low enough that it was only for him. His father did it in 1961. 2 families on the south end of the valley. Both had operations that were becoming valuable. Both had debt structures that could be pressured at the right moment. A pause. The county kept the records. I looked them up when Stitt started coming around with his piece of paper 2 years ago. Kenneth said, "Why didn't you tell anyone before now?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been sitting with this question themselves and has an answer they've tested. Because telling someone that a pattern exists doesn't stop the pattern. The pattern stops when the outcome changes. She looked at the room, the farmers still talking, the paperwork being signed, the story completing itself. The outcome changed. He didn't know what to say to that. "Your wife would have come to me first," Margaret said. "She would have found her way to the records and organized the whole thing differently from the start." A pause with weight in it. "You got there a different way. You got there anyway, Mr. David Cole." She left the way she came. He watched her go and thought about the routes different people take to the same necessary place, and how the route you take shapes what you understand when you arrive, and how he'd needed to come through the creek bank at night, and the kitchen arithmetic, and the things Gary said that were true, even when they hurt to be true, because arriving any other way would have meant arriving without the full knowledge of what he'd built and what it had cost to build it. He thought, sometimes the longer road is the one that gets you there knowing what you're carrying. He turned back to where Sharon was closing her ledger, the paperwork complete, the signatures where they needed to be. He thought, Donna would have had them signed up before he finished talking. And then he thought the other thing, the thing that followed it and that he'd have to sit with for a while before he knew what it meant. She'd also have made sure he learned to finish the talking himself. The bridge loan cleared on a Friday. The bank processed it without ceremony, which was the correct response to a transaction that should never have required this much difficulty to reach. Kenneth drove to Bell Valley Bank in Millhaven, signed the paperwork at the same window where the original restructuring agreement had been executed 18 months earlier, and walked out into the August sun with the mortgage current and 23 days of pressure lifted from his chest in a single transaction that took 11 minutes. He sat in the truck for a while before driving home. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel. Relief, certainly, and the relief was there, but it had a different texture than he'd anticipated. Quieter, less dramatic, the way the end of a long physical effort feels when you finally stop moving. Not triumphant, but simply still. The crisis had been real. The resolution was real. What sat between them was a specific kind of gratitude that didn't have a clean object, that distributed itself across a room full of people and a field full of ducks, and a woman who walked fence lines on Sundays, and a son who'd been holding money in reserve for 2 years, without saying so. He drove home with the windows down. The valley was gold in the way it gets in mid-August, the hills going dry and warm, the air carrying the smell of cut grass from the neighbors who'd finished their hay already, and the darker, heavier smell of the creek running low in its banks. He turned off the county road through his gate and came down the lane and parked and sat in the truck, looking at the lower field for a moment before getting out. The rice was changing color, not dramatically, not yet. But the shift was happening in the way gradual things happen, imperceptibly on any individual day, unmistakably across a week. The heads that had been uniformly green through July were beginning to show gold at the tips, the color moving down the grain, from the very top of each kernel with the slow patience of a process that has its own timeline and is not interested in yours. In the areas where the seeding had been densest, where the duck activity had been most concentrated and the soil biology most thoroughly altered, the change was furthest along. From the fence, those sections of the field looked like late afternoon had settled into them several hours before the rest of the landscape. He walked the fence that evening, with his hands in his pockets, and let himself look at it without running numbers. Just the field, just the way it was. Timothy Goss had been out 2 weeks earlier with his notebook and his soil cores and his camera taking documentation photos for what he described with the contained excitement of a scientist who has learned to manage his enthusiasm in public, as the most significant regional agricultural data he'd collected in 8 years of work. He'd spent 4 hours on the property, and when he left, he'd told Kenneth that he was going to present the Drayfield case as the centerpiece of a paper he'd been drafting for the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture, and that he expected the paper to generate interest from extension services in at least 3 states. Kenneth had said, "Will that help anything practical?" Goss had paused at his car door with the honesty of a man who respects the question enough not to inflate the answer. "It will help next year," he said, "and the year after. What you've proven here doesn't stop mattering because the season ends." He'd gotten in and driven out the lane with the careful speed of someone thinking about something else. "What you've proven here doesn't stop mattering." Kenneth held on to that. Not in the way of a man polishing a trophy, but in the way of someone who needs a fixed point to orient by when the terrain is still shifting underfoot. He'd been building toward something for 5 months, without being entirely certain what that something was. And now that the immediate crisis had resolved, he could feel the larger shape of it beginning to clarify, the way objects in a fog become distinct not all at once but feature by feature. The edges arriving before the whole. The week after the Grange meeting had its own particular quality. The valley talked, because the valley always talked, but the conversation had changed register. There is a difference between being discussed as the subject of pity or derision and being discussed as the subject of something harder to categorize, something the community hasn't made up its mind about yet because the outcome is still open. People who'd stood along the road in April and shaken their heads now found reasons to slow their trucks when they passed his gate. A few stopped, not many. But enough to notice Martin, from the south end of the valley, came by on a Wednesday morning with a specific question about the margin planting. His wife had read about companion planting methods and wanted to try something similar on the damp ground behind their barn. Kenneth spent 40 minutes at the fence, explaining what he'd done, what had worked and what he'd do differently, the soil preparation and the variety selection and the timing. He answered everything, directly and without embellishment, and Martin shook his hand at the end and said something that Kenneth turned over in his mind for the rest of the day. "You know what Donna would have said about all this," he said. "What?" Martin had smiled, the kind that carries several things at once. "She would have said she told you so. And she would have been right. And you would have pretended to be annoyed. And then you both would have been happy about it for the rest of the day." He'd stood at the fence after Martin left and let that sit in him for a while. Not painfully. Just fully. Margaret Finch came on a Saturday, in the last week of August. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't spoken to her, beyond the passing acknowledgments of neighbors who share a road and a wave. But she came with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has organized her schedule around something without making a production of the organization. She was 72 and moved with the precise economy of someone who has decided not to waste what's left of her physical resources on anything that doesn't warrant spending them. She walked the length of the lower field's fence without speaking. He walked beside her. He'd learned, over 11 years in Drayfield, that Margaret Finch's silences were informational rather than empty, that she was showing you something by maintaining them, and that interrupting them was the wrong move. He waited. At the far corner where the fence turned and the view of the field opened up across its full width, she stopped. His father did it in 1961, she said. Not as preamble. Directly, as she did everything. 2 families on the south end of the valley. Both had operations that were becoming valuable. Both had debt structures that could be pressured at the right moment. It took about 14 months from the first conversation to the final transfer, and at no point did anyone do anything that was technically illegal. She looked at the field. The county kept the records. "I looked them up when Stitt started coming around with his piece of paper," Kenneth said. "Why didn't you tell anyone before the Grange meeting?" She turned to look at him with the expression of someone who has been asked a question they've been sitting with themselves for a while. Because telling someone that a pattern exists doesn't stop the pattern. The pattern stops when the outcome changes. She looked back at the field, at the rice standing in its late summer fullness, at the ducks working the shallower zones with their habitual focus. The outcome changed. He didn't know what to say to that. So he didn't say anything, which was the correct response. "Your wife would have come to me," Margaret said. She would have found her way to the county records and put 2 and 2 together and organized the whole thing differently from the start. A pause waited with something that wasn't quite regret, but was in the same neighborhood. "You got there a different way." "You got there anyway." She left the way she came, walking back to the road with the deliberate pace of someone who has delivered what she brought and doesn't need to linger over the delivery. He watched her go. He thought about patterns and the ways they end, about the accumulation of individuals' choices that either perpetuate or interrupt what has been running too long without interruption. He thought about Donna moving through the valley with her instinct for the human architecture of things, always understanding before he did which people were the load-bearing ones, always knowing which conversations needed to happen before the crisis and not after it. He'd needed to come through all of it the hard way, the creek bank at night, and the kitchen arithmetic that never quite balanced, and the fence post at dawn on the morning of the flood. He'd needed to arrive at the Grange Hall, having done the work himself, carrying the evidence of it in a burlap bag, because arriving any other way would have meant arriving without knowing what he'd built and what it had taken to build it. Some knowledge can't be transferred. It can only be earned by the specific sequence of decisions that produce it. The thought settled in him with the weight of something that had been waiting to be thought. He went back to the house and called Daniel. Not the every 2 weeks call. The other kind, the one you make when something has clarified and you want to say it while the clarity is still fresh. Daniel picked up quickly, and Kenneth told him about Margaret Finch's visit, about the conversation at the fence corner. And then he said the thing he'd been moving toward without quite naming. "I've been thinking about what next year looks like." Daniel was quiet for a moment on the other end. "Bigger," he said. "Not a question." "Bigger," Kenneth confirmed. "The north edge has drainage potential I haven't touched. Goss thinks another 8 to 10 acres could be brought into the system in a managed way without overextending the operation. The margin greens could triple with the right planting schedule. And the duck population. He paused. The duck population is a resource I've been thinking about wrong. They're not just a tool for this field. They're a product in themselves. You're talking about eggs and meat. I'm talking about eggs primarily. The volume we're producing now is what one serious chef wants. A second relationship, a third, and the flock pays for itself differently than it does right now. Daniel was quiet again, but it was the productive quiet of someone working through implications rather than waiting for more information. You'd need help. I would. Someone who knows the finances well enough to build a growth plan. Someone like that, yes, he left it there. He didn't push it further, because pushing it further would have been the wrong kind of pressure, and he'd learned enough about timing this year to know the difference between planting and harvesting, between the moment when you seed something and the moment when you wait for it to come up on its own terms. They talked for another 30 minutes about other things, about Daniel's work and about a friend of Daniel's who'd asked about visiting the farm, about the water heater that still hadn't been replaced, and that Daniel suggested, with a patient firmness of someone who has mentioned this before, might benefit from being replaced before winter. Kenneth said he'd look into it. He meant it this time, which was different from the previous times he'd said it. The harvest began in the third week of September. It began in the sections that had developed first, the southeast corner where seeding density and duck concentration had combined to create the most favorable conditions, and it moved outward from there over the course of a week, as the rest of the field reached the same threshold. Kenneth rented the equipment he needed from an agricultural co-op in Millhaven, a small combine adapted for wet field conditions, a model typically used in coastal cranberry operations that Gox had identified as appropriate for the depth and variability of the Drayfield field. He'd driven it himself the previous Tuesday in an empty lot behind the co-op, with a patient mechanic sitting beside him, explaining the controls in the specific tone of a man who has done this before with first-time operators, and has learned to make no assumptions. The learning curve on the equipment was real and steep, and he managed it the way he'd managed other steep learning curves over 58 years, which was by proceeding carefully and accepting that the first hour would be worse than the second, and the second worse than the third and the third, approaching something like competence. Daniel arrived Thursday evening with 2 duffel bags and the expression of someone who has taken time off work without making a big announcement about it. He'd driven down from Portland without telling his father he was coming until he was 40 minutes out, which was enough notice to know he was welcome, but not enough to be talked out of coming. He pulled into the lane and got out and looked at the field in the last of the evening light without saying anything for a moment. "It's gold," he said finally. "Most of it, I knew it was growing. I knew what you were doing." He stopped, looked again. The words came out slowly, like something being turned over before being released. "I didn't actually think about what it would look like." Kenneth watched his son look at the field, the way you watch someone encounter something that has rearranged their understanding of a situation they thought they understood. Daniel had received all his information about the operation through phone calls, and Sharon's weekly summaries, which communicated facts, but not the fact of the thing, the physical weight of 300 ducks working 20 acres over 4 months, the accumulated result of it. Standing in the evening light, with its heads bent down under the gold of full maturity, he said, "Are you staying through the harvest?" Daniel turned. "Yeah, no hesitation. I talked to my manager. I've got 10 days. You didn't have to do that, I know." His son looked back at the field. "I wanted to see it." They went inside, and Kenneth made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked properly for the first time in what Kenneth calculated was probably 20 months. Not the careful phone calls with their careful structure, actually talked. About the farm, about what the next season could look like, about what the rice had shown and what it hadn't shown, and what questions it raised for the year ahead. About Daniel's work in Portland, which was going in a direction he'd been uncertain about until recently, and was now going somewhere more definite. About Donna, Daniel said, looking at the table in the way of someone releasing something they've been holding carefully for a long time. She used to take me out to the lower field when I was small. Before I knew what the low ground meant or why it was different, she'd crouch down and put her hand in the dirt and make me do the same and say, "Feel how it holds water. Feel how it stores it," she said. The low ground was the memory of the field. All the water that had ever come through stayed in the soil. Kenneth held his coffee mug. "I didn't know she said that. You were up top. You were always managing the crop." Daniel looked at the table. She was always down at the edge, doing something. He sat with the image of it. Donna crouching at the field's margin with a small boy beside her, teaching him to read soil with his hands the way she read everything. Directly, with her whole attention, treating the knowledge as something worth having, rather than something incidental. She'd been teaching their son what she hadn't yet had the occasion to teach Kenneth himself. She'd understood the field's potential so completely that she'd passed it on to Daniel as a natural fact, years before either of them knew what to do with it. The low ground was the memory of the field, he thought. She knew what that ground could do before any of us did. She was waiting for the right year. And then he thought the thing that followed from it, the thing that arrived fully formed and sat in the kitchen light with the weight of something true. Some gifts take a long time to open, and the delay isn't waste. It's the preparation for understanding what you're holding when you finally do. The harvest ran through the final days of September and into the first week of October, the combine moving through the now drained field in slow, methodical passes, while the 300 ducks worked the margin zones and the cut rows behind it, collecting what the machine left with their characteristic focused thoroughness. The field had been drained over 2 weeks prior to harvest. The water level drawn down gradually through the outlets Kenneth had cut in the second month of the operation, the soil in the lower areas given time to firm up enough to support the equipment's weight. The ducks adapted to the changed conditions without drama. They redistributed themselves across the available water, concentrated in the drainage channels, and the remaining shallow areas continued their work at lower density, but with the same purposefulness they'd maintained all summer. Goss came for the harvest. He came with his notebook and his soil cores as usual, but this time he also brought a second notebook for the yield data, which he collected from each pass of the combine with the systematic care of a man who is building an evidential record that he intends to defend in front of people who will look for weaknesses in it. He recorded variety, row, section, moisture content at harvest, estimated dry weight. He asked Kenneth questions between passes and wrote the answers in the second notebook with the date and time next to each entry. At the end of the second day of harvest, Goss sat on the truck's tailgate with his notebook closed in his lap and told Kenneth the numbers. The yield was not spectacular. He said this first, with the care of a scientist who is trying to prevent a specific kind of misunderstanding. The yield was not what a seasoned rice producer in an established region would consider remarkable. The per-acre numbers were not records. What they were, Goss said, was significant. They were significant because they had been produced on ground that had been written off by everyone who saw it in April. They were significant because they had been produced using a method that required almost no synthetic inputs, no pesticide application, minimal fertilizer, water management accomplished by biology rather than chemistry. They were significant because the soil biology data he'd collected over the growing period showed a field that was measurably healthier at harvest than it had been when the flood arrived. A result he said he'd never expected to see in a single season, and was not entirely sure how to explain, except as an argument for the method's fundamental soundness. He closed his notebook, looked out at the field, at the ducks moving through the stubble with their habitual industry. Then he said, with the particular emphasis of someone who has saved the most important thing for last, "You know what the most significant number is." Kenneth waited. "Your field will produce more next year. The soil you're handing next season is better than the soil you started with. Every year you run this system on that ground, the baseline goes up." He put the notebook in his jacket pocket. Most farming systems extract from the land over time. This one accumulates. That's not a small thing. That's the whole difference between a method and a philosophy. Gary came for the final day of harvest. He drove up the lane mid-morning without calling first, and parked at the field's edge, and got out and stood with his arms crossed, watching the combine move through what remained. He didn't say much. He watched. He asked a few technical questions about the yield figures, and listened to the answers, and nodded. In the way that means the numbers are going to be processed and stored and revisited later, rather than commented on immediately. After the last pass, when the combine was stopped, and the field was finished, and the numbers were what they were, Gary walked to the fence and looked out at the stubble and the remaining shallow water, and the ducks moving across it in the unhurried way of animals whose world has just changed configuration and who are adapting without complaint, he said, his voice carrying the plainness of a man for whom honesty is a form of respect rather than a weapon. I told you to take the safe thing. Kenneth looked at the field. I wasn't sure I was right. I was sure I wasn't ready to be wrong. Gary absorbed this, turned it over in the way he turned everything over, without hurry, without performing the process. Difference between stubborn and patient is hard to see from the outside, probably hard to see from the inside too. For a while, Gary made a sound that in another man might have been a laugh. He looked at the field a while longer. Then he said, "What's next year look like?" Kenneth had been thinking about next year since July, in the way that a person who has committed to a direction can't help but think forward along it, extrapolating from what's working toward what might work further. He'd talked to Goss about rotation options, about the possibility of expanding the managed water area by improving the drainage control on the field's northern edge, about what a second season with an established duck population, one that had already adapted to the specific ecology of the lower 20, might produce relative to this first season's baseline. He'd talked to Sharon about market expansion, about whether the greens operation along the margins could be scaled significantly without losing the quality that had made it valuable to Brian Culver and Sandra Morvell. He'd talked to Daniel in the evenings of that first week of harvest about the calculations involved, and Daniel had listened with the focused attention of someone who is not just hearing information, but integrating it into a picture that is becoming relevant to his own decisions. He didn't say all of this to Gary, he said. "Bigger." Gary nodded once, put his thumbs in his jacket pockets. "Come talk to me before you plan the drainage work on the north side. I know where the water table sits over there better than you do," he said he would. He meant it. The mortgage was current. The bridge loan was structured against the harvest receipts, which arrived from Brian Culver, and from the two wholesale accounts Sharon had connected him with in late September, a natural foods co-op in Eugene that had purchased a substantial portion of the rice for a premium they said reflected both the quality and the story of how it was grown, and a specialty grain distributor in Portland, who'd contacted Kenneth through Goss after reading a preliminary version of the bulletin piece and asked whether he'd have supply available in future seasons. He paid the bridge loan from the harvest. He paid a portion of the residual debt service, Mr. David Cole. He put the remainder in the farm account with the specific satisfaction of looking at a balance that was moving in the right direction for the first time in 2 years. He called Daniel on a Sunday evening in mid-October, 3 weeks after the harvest finished and the field had been drained and the ducks were working the bare soil of the lower 20. With the same focus they'd brought to the water all summer, doing now to the earth what they'd done to the water, stirring and fertilizing and preparing it for the spring that would eventually come around again. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay, you mentioned your manager, taking the time off for the harvest." A pause. "How much of that was a temporary thing, and how much was you thinking about something larger?" The silence on Daniel's end was not the silence of someone caught unprepared. It was the silence of someone who had been waiting for this particular question for longer than the conversation had been running. "I've been thinking about something larger," he said finally. "Not elaborate. Just the fact of it, laid out, about coming back. About coming back. Not a question. An acknowledgement of something already half decided." Kenneth looked out the kitchen window. The field was dark, The last light gone behind the ridge, but he knew exactly what was out there. The contours of it, the way the ground lay, and the way the water would come back in April, and the work the water would begin back in April, and the deep decisions that would need to be made about the north edge drainage, and the second rotation, and the expansion that the market was beginning to make room for, he said. I could use someone who knows numbers well enough to build forward from them. Another silence. It's a big change. It is. I need to understand the finances thoroughly before I made any decisions. Sharon can walk you through everything. She's been keeping the operational records since May's. A pause. You've talked to Sharon about this. She raised the question first. 2 weeks ago, he could hear something shift on Daniel's end, the specific acoustic quality of a smile, that someone is trying not to let into their voice and not quite managing. Of course she did. They talked for another 40 minutes about the specifics. About what the farm's financial picture actually looked like, and what it needed, and what the next 3 years of responsible development might reasonably produce. And Daniel asked the right questions in the right order. The questions of someone who has been preparing for a conversation without knowing exactly when it would happen. By the end, Kenneth had not asked anything directly, and Daniel had not agreed to anything directly, and both of them understood perfectly what had just been established. After he hung up, Kenneth sat at the kitchen table and opened Donna's green folder. He did this sometimes. Not every night, not on a schedule. When something had happened that he wanted to place in relation to everything she'd built here, to verify that what he was building was continuous with what she'd started. That the shape of it was recognizable to what she'd meant when she'd said, "This land has potential," and looked at him with the patience of someone waiting for him to catch up. He looked at the accounts in her handwriting. The records of 11 years, the columns adding up and sometimes not adding up, the notes in the margins that were sometimes practical and sometimes something else. A small observation about the condition of the lower soil after a wet February. A note about a conversation she'd had with the county extension officer in 2009, about grains that could tolerate wet year conditions. A question mark next to a number that had puzzled her, and that she'd presumably resolved because there was no follow-up note. Only the question mark, and then the next entry. There was a page near the back that he'd read before, but that registered differently now. A page from the last October, 9 months before she died, written in the handwriting she'd been using when her energy was lower, the letters still precise, but made with less pressure than usual, the pen moving more carefully. She'd been doing end-of-season accounting, and partway through she'd written something that wasn't accounting. She'd written, "The low field will surprise him. He's too close to see it yet, but he will." He sat at the table with the folder open and read that line several times. She hadn't said she hoped he would. She hadn't said she thought he might. She'd written it the way she wrote everything she believed completely. Flat, certain, the fact delivered and left on the page for the appropriate moment. The appropriate moment had taken 2 years and a flood and 300 ducks and a woman who walked fence lines on Sundays, and a room full of noibs who turned out to be something more than an audience for his difficulty. He closed the folder carefully, put it back in the second drawer of her desk, which was also his desk now, which had been his desk for 2 years, but that he still thought of as hers, which was fine. Some things could hold two realities without contradiction. Some things were better for holding two at once. Sharon came on Sunday the way she'd been coming since June, without making a point of it, the way the useful fixtures of a life establish themselves. Through repetition, that becomes expectation, that becomes, at some stage, something you'd notice the absence of, without being able to account immediately for what was missing. She came with coffee in her thermos and her canvas bag, and the quiet efficiency of someone who is at home in a situation, without having needed to make a formal declaration of it. They walked the lower field in the October light, which was different from any light the field had held while she'd been walking it. Not the gray April light of the flood's first days, not the green light of June's emergence, not the gold of September's maturity. October light in the Drayfield Valley came in at a low angle, and lay across the landscape like a consideration, illuminating the tops of things and leaving the shadows longer than the objects that made them. The stubble of the harvested rice caught it and held it in the way that cut grain does, a warm amber that didn't look like wealth, but felt like it. She told him about a conversation she'd had with a food writer in Eugene who'd heard about the operation through the co-op and wanted to do a piece about the method, about the story of the flooded field and what had grown in it. She said the writer had asked her a number of questions. She'd deflected, because she hadn't been sure what Kenneth would want in print, and she'd thought he should decide that himself. He thought about what he would want in print. He thought about Beaumont, crouching in his Louisiana field in 1988 with his hat and his boots that had shaped themselves to his feet, pointing at ducks and rice like they were obvious. He thought about the fact that Beaumont had probably told that story to other people, probably many times, and the story had not traveled far enough to reach a farmer in Oregon who needed it 35 years later. He thought about Goss saying, "What you've proven here doesn't stop mattering because the season ends." He thought about the extension services in 3 states that Goss expected to be interested in the paper. "Tell her yes," he said. "Tell her I'll talk to her." Sharon nodded, made a note in her small leather-bound notebook. He'd noticed early on that she never wrote things she would remember on her own. She only wrote things she needed the notebook for. It was an efficient system that told you a great deal about how a person organized their mind, if you knew how to read what they chose not to carry alone. They came to the fence corner where the field turned and the full view opened up, the same corner where he'd stood with Margaret Finch 3 weeks earlier, the same corner where he'd stood in April with the water up to the second rail and the cold air on his face, and a memory from 35 years ago beginning to surface in the back of his mind. The field looked entirely different now. The same ground, the same boundaries, the same corner post that Donna had painted white in their first summer here, and that had been weathered back to the color of old wood over 11 years. Everything else changed. He said, "Daniel's thinking about coming back." Sharon looked at the field. "I know, you know. He called me 2 weeks ago." She wasn't apologetic about it. He wanted the numbers before he decided anything. He thought about this. "You didn't tell me. You would have tried to move the conversation toward a decision before he was ready." She said it the way she said numbers that were simply what they were. He needed to think first. He considered being annoyed about this and found he couldn't sustain it. She was right, and he knew she was right, and she'd handled it the way Donna would have handled it, which was to say she'd handled it in the way that produced the best outcome for the person who needed room to reach it, rather than the outcome that would have satisfied his impatience. He said, "You manage people the way you manage accounts." She looked at him briefly. "Everything balances if you give it enough time and don't force the numbers." The ducks were working the far side of the field in the October light, 30 or 40 of them concentrated in a low area near the drainage channel, where the soil was still damp enough to interest them, doing whatever ducks do to soil when there's no water to work through, which turned out to be not entirely different from what they'd done all summer. Scratching, turning, leaving behind the biological argument for their continued presence. They were fat now. 4 months on an abundant and varied diet had produced birds that looked substantially different from the thin and undistinguished flock he'd bought in the April parking lot at Millhaven, the 300 that nobody wanted, and that he'd bought for a price that made the auctioneer blink. They'd been worth considerably more than the price. He watched them work and thought about value, about the gap between what a thing appears to be worth and what it actually is, about how the gap usually runs in one direction. How people overestimate the value of things that look impressive and underestimate the value of things that look ordinary, and how the ducks had been ordinary in the specific way that useful things often are, conspicuously unpretentious, doing their work without requiring anyone to appreciate it. 300 ducks on 20 acres, the Alantadoan. The idea that had made the auctioneer blink and the room in Millhaven laugh and half the valley come out to watch and shake their heads on that May morning when he'd opened the crates at the edge of the flooded field. He thought about the line he'd carried from Bellard for 37 years. The one about rivers and wrestling matches, and he thought that the thing Bellard understood. That Beaumont had demonstrated in a Louisiana field, and that the lower 20 had proven in its own way over the course of a single impossible season, was not really about rivers or ducks or flooded ground. It was about the difference between the strength you spend fighting what exists and the intelligence you spend working with it. The first kind runs out, the second kind accumulates. You get better at it, the way the soil got better, the way the field compounded its own improvement over the course of a season, handing the next year a better starting point than the year before. He was 58. 58. The knee was what it was. The farmhouse still needed a new water heater, which had been true for 2 years, and which he had now actually scheduled to be replaced the following Tuesday. A fact that would have pleased Daniel, and would have pleased Donna, and that pleased him also, in the small, quiet way of someone who has finally stopped deferring the necessary things. The calendar had an October date circling toward November and a November circling toward the winter that would be quiet. In the way the farm was always quiet in winter, work reduced to maintenance and planning, and the long domestic hours of a season that demands patience more than labor. He didn't feel old in the way. He'd been feeling old earlier in the year, in the months after Donna's death, when 58 felt like an age that had arrived ahead of schedule with an inventory of losses and a dwindling inventory of the other thing. He felt like 58. He felt like a man who had come through a season that had required most of what he had and had found, on the other side of it, that he had more than he'd thought. Which is how the most important seasons tend to work. You discover the resource by spending it. You find the floor is lower than you feared, and the ceiling higher than you'd allowed yourself to believe. The October light moved across the field. The ducks worked the drainage channel without interruption. Somewhere behind them, up the rise, the farmhouse sat in the day's last warmth, with its scheduled water heater appointment, and its second drawer, with the green folder in it, and its kitchen table, where he'd done the arithmetic that kept not adding up, and then, eventually, did. Sharon stood beside him at the fence corner, and they looked at the field without any particular need to say something about it. After a while, she said, "What are you going to do with the margins next spring?" The lettuce areas. He'd been thinking about this. He'd been thinking about it since mid-September, when the first lettuce planting had been fully exhausted, and the soil it came out of was noticeably richer than the soil it had gone into, the continuous cycle of organic matter returning to the bed from trimmings and compost, and the inevitable small losses that accumulate in any production system, feeding back into the ground and making it better, rather than depleted. Expand them. 6 rows instead of 3. Different varieties for different seasons. So there's something coming in from March through November. Brian will take more. Brian asked for more. There's also the Portland market. She paused. The pause had a shape to it. If Daniel comes, she was quiet for a moment. Then, he'll come. He looked at her sideways. You've decided? He asked the right questions. She said it with the precision of a woman who understood what the right questions indicated when someone asked them. People don't ask about drainage schedules and crop rotation calendars because they're curious about farming in the abstract. They ask because they're planning something specific. He let that settle in the way of something that confirms what you already knew but needed to hear confirmed. The last of the direct light left the field as the sun moved behind the ridge, the temperature dropping 2 or 3 degrees in the 15 seconds it took for the shade to cross the stubble. The ducks felt it and responded the way they always responded to the day's shift toward evening. Not alarm, just a collective reorientation, a general movement in the direction of the coop that would become a specific procession in the next 20 minutes. 4 months of the same pattern, established one evening at a time, carved into the behavior of 300 birds as a route and a time, as reliable as anything mechanical, and considerably more interesting to watch. Kenneth watched the first of them begin the drift toward the eastern edge of the field where the coop sat on its raised platform in the dry ground above the waterline. The others followed by the logic of birds, by the mechanism of creatures that moved together without needing to discuss it, and the drift became a line. And the line became a column, and the column became a procession, with the unhurried dignity of something that has always done exactly this and sees no reason to do it differently. He'd built the coop from scrap lumber in the first week of May. Repaired it twice since. Replaced the latch on the main gate with sturdier hardware when the original showed wear. It had held through a summer of nightly use. Through the raccoon that had tried the perimeter fence 4 times before concluding. The effort wasn't worth it. Through the rain of early September that had found a weakness in the roof he'd patched before it became a problem. You maintained things. That was the whole of it. Finally, you paid attention and you maintained things and you let the season do what seasons did, and what the season did if you'd done the other things was compound. The procession reached the coop and the first birds went in, and the others followed. And Kenneth walked down to secure it. The knee reporting the incline the way it always did, the same information it had been providing since 1992, familiar enough by now to be less complaint than weather report. He closed the gate, latched it, stewed in the early dark for a moment. The field was quiet. The creek was quiet. Somewhere on the road beyond the property line, a truck passed with its lights on, and the lights swept briefly across the stubble of the lower 20. And, for a moment, you could see the whole shape of the place. The cut rows and the drainage channels and the margin strips and the flat productive geometry of what had been, 5 months ago, an April flood's indifferent aftermath. What it was now was harder to name but easier to see. A thing worked over and made better by the working. A collaboration between water and birds and soil and a 58-year-old man who had learned, in the span of a single season, the difference between fighting a loss and farming it. He turned and walked back up the rise to where the farmhouse light was on in the kitchen's window and Sharon was inside, already at the table with her notebook, already at the work of the next thing. He went in through the back door, pulled off his boots in the mudroom, the left one first, the right one second with that half-second pause. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and the particular combination of outdoor cold and indoor warmth. That is one of the specific pleasures of autumn in a working farmhouse. Sharon looked up when he came in and looked back at her notebook and said, "The Eugene Co-op called while you were outside. They want to double the order next season." He went to the counter, poured a coffee, stood there a moment, looking at the window, at the dark outside and the reflection of the lit kitchen in the glass, the farm and the house occupying the same frame. "Double the order," he said. "Double the order." He looked at the window for a moment longer. He thought about 20 acres of water in April and what he'd built in it. He thought about Bellard and Beaumont and Donna's sticky note and the Grange Hall and Daniel asking about drainage schedules. He thought about the way a field that has been given the right conditions tends toward abundance rather than away from it. And how the same might be said of most things worth tending. He sat down across from Sharon and put his coffee on the table between them. "Tell them yes," he said. And the evening, with its work still in it, and its next season already assembling itself in the space between two people at a kitchen table, continued.